Have you ever thought about which pies people in the past enjoyed the most? There are many forgotten treasures of the pie world that have simply vanished as time passes by. Come along as we discuss 20 of the most famous pies that once took center stage on dinner tables. The Mince Meat Pie was a staple holiday pie that was quite popular, especially during Christmas. This will typically consist of finely minced meat, diced fruit, and liquid to preserve the meat's freshness. Now, the dish itself has been famous since the early 14th century. Mincemeat pie was an innovative way of making sure meat would last for a longer time without curing it or salting it. Since then, the recipe has gone through so many changes that there's a mincemeat pie out there for just about every kind of palate, not just for preserving meat. You could even find pre-made mince pies in the grocery stores once when this pie was at its peak popularity as a holiday special. Does this bring back any fond Christmas memories for you? The Shoefly Pie was enjoyed in Pennsylvania Dutch country. It had a niche popularity since its inception in the late 1800s. It actually became pretty popular around the Pennsylvania area as a coffee cake and then as a popular choice for home bakers. It used to be a regular part of breakfast if you were from there. Bakeries usually served this in two types, with a wet or dry bottom, with the former having a thinner crust and a thicker outer layer, while the latter more so resembles a cake. Traditionally, both have to include molasses, but for people who aren't Pennsylvania natives, bakeries sometimes switched it out for corn syrup. With the introduction of newer pies and innovative recipes, bakeries started shifting towards newer pies. The Shoefly Pie became somewhat of a figment from the past. Today, we can only reminisce about this tempting pie as many bakeries stopped production on it years ago. A sugar cream pie, or also known as Hoosier pie, maintained regional popularity in Indiana. This pie from the 1900s suffered the same fate that many other treats on this list did. When you think of this, start picturing a sweet creme brulee with a custard filling and some cinnamon sprinkled for good measure. Now, this definitely was a lot more popular back in the 90s because of how easy the Hoosier sugar cream pie was to make. From bakeries to households, mostly everyone would have a go at creating the sugar cream pie. With the pie being mentioned in many cookbooks from the early 1900s, we learned that the trick to getting that sweet, scrumptious flavor is letting the pie rest overnight. Many bakeries would create the pies and let them rest overnight so that they could have the best pie to serve the next day. This extensive and high-effort procedure was what led to the pie's downfall. Bakeries understood that extensive labor and waiting times for one pie was not reasonable. Slowly and surely, this pie started disappearing from shelves until one day it completely faded into history. Ever heard of a chess pie? This southern favorite was relatively well known, especially in the South. It includes pantry staples like a filling with butter, eggs, sugar, flour, milk, and it goes back to at least the 1850s. It's been theorized that the pie probably came over from England, but the fine details of the truth are anyone's guess. What is certain, however, is that this pie is a Southern classic. How you want to prepare this depends on you. It resembles a cheesecake, but it can go either citrusy with a lemon flavor or a chocolate savory approach instead. You just need one crust and a basic filling, though some also add cornmeal for a thicker consistency. It's always nice when you can spin a pie 10 different ways. With any dish that is centuries old, you can expect it to either be lost in tradition or carried forward. The chess pie's fate suffered from the latter. As time went on, less and less people started making and serving this pie until this treat completely got lost. The Raisin Pie is a common dessert. It was most popular as a funeral dish in Amish communities, especially because it didn't require preservation, freeing up hands for other work. There are variations on how to prepare it, but most agree that a double crust topped with a lattice is essential. If you were to draw a mental image, think of a mincemeat pie with raisins and a thicker crust. The pie gained somewhat of a bad reputation because of its association with funerals. Some considered it to be a bad omen, and so it lost its popularity amongst masses. Maybe the next time you need to bring something to a funeral, you can keep this in mind. You might have heard of bread and butter pudding, but the pie form is less common now. From the 12th century to the 21st, this staple of the populaces has gone through relentless change. The version that has vanished, however, is the bread and butter pudding pie. A rather confusing mix of pie crust with pudding, this pie was well loved amongst English and American crowds in the 1900s. Much like the name suggests, it was a fusion of pie crust with a custard filling made out of bread and butter pudding. It met its downfall, however, as people preferred the iconic pudding form over a pie that could not be consumed in one sitting. It had a short run amongst the people and became a weird combination that was forgotten in history. A rather puzzling pie is the vinegar pie. Many of you today may feel grateful that this pie is gone, but back in the day, this old-fashioned pie was more of a marvel and culinary masterpiece. This pie, nicknamed the Desperation Pie, came to be at a time of economic difficulty and uncertainty. It quickly became a staple in households that wanted to experience the awe of eating pies, but could not exactly find ingredients to make other famous pies. Becoming especially popular in the Midwest when lemons were not as easily available. People in such desperation turned towards creating a pie filled with a tangy custard. But instead of using expensive citrus fruits, they used vinegar to create the flavor, thus creating the now-forgotten vinegar pie. Dating back to the mid-1800s, mock apple pie first came into being during the wintertime. The season of winter would often bring scarcity of fruits. One such fruit was apples. So the bakers at the time turned towards creating a pie closest to apple pie, but without apples. Hence the name mock apple pie. Known for its clever use of Ritz crackers to mock the texture of apples, it was also surprisingly budget-friendly. In the 1900s, when the popularity of crackers increased, mock apple pie seemed to be a fan favorite. This pie used ingredients like breadcrumbs, sugar, cinnamon, water, lemon, and crackers. The surprising part was, people could not tell that this pie did not include apples at all. But as food companies started producing fruits that could be sold all year round, the need for a mock apple pie decreased, resulting in it being sidelined for a real apple pie. Possum pie was a regional specialty in Arkansas. If the name seems unheard of, that might be because this pie was not widely known outside the region. Back in the 1970s, the possum pie was all the rage in Arkansas. It was popularized by its mention in a 1983 restaurant review in Arkansas Gazette, naming the pie to be one of the best things Arkansas has to offer. Before its popularity died down, you'd be able to spot this pie in bakeries because of its distinct crumb crust and big size, due to its several layers. By several, we mean a lot of layers of chocolate, vanilla, cream cheese, and even whipped cream. This nut crumb crust pudding pie, however, started seeing its downfall around the 2000s when food critics started frowning upon heavy and extremely sweet desserts. As less people bought the possum pies, less bakeries created it, thus leading to the ultimate downfall of this treat. The Marlboro Pie has an interesting history. Emerging first in England, the pie disappeared around the 1660s, with its only mentions being in English cookbooks. Almost 116 years later, these cookbooks were used to bring the Marlboro Pie to life in America. It automatically became a popular choice for any sort of Thanksgiving celebration. The English and American version was prepared with a staggering 24 eggs, beaten until you could not feel your arm, some cinnamon, minced apples, and butter. It became a hit across the land of the America. It would not have its rise to fame last too long because the sheer amount of effort it took to create this pie would have bakers choosing to stock other treats instead of this. As pecan pies and cherry pies became more popular Thanksgiving desserts, the Marlboro Pie faded into history. Much like the Marlboro Pie, Gooseberry Pie was also famous in Europe before they found their footing in America. It's a rather unknown pie now because gooseberries were becoming less common, leading to a decline in this pie's popularity. But when it was prepared, the pie used fresh gooseberries with the ends either removed or trimmed, quarter of a cup of a potato, and any pie crust available. The ingredient list seems odd, but it would make for a perfect pie. Many would wonder why this pie went out of fashion, and the answer is simple. With the increase of pies like strawberry and apple pies, using a fruit like gooseberry, which is expensive and not readily available, became more of a hassle. Ultimately, this pie disappeared from American cuisine. The grapefruit meringue pie was a rather unusual pie that never gained widespread popularity, but was definitely consumed in some parts of the country. We can say this because you could find it in cookbooks in the 1920s as an easy-to-make and delicious pie that many would enjoy. Though it could never gain popularity in middle-class and lower-income houses because of its requirement to always use fresh grapefruits, which were expensive in the 1900s. Its recipe was immortalized in cookbooks in case it ever found its popularity in later years. Created like any other pie, the ingredients were eggs, vanilla, grapefruit, pie crust, and a whole lot of patience to create a meringue. The wait time to create this pie paired with its rather expensive ingredients lead to this pie being ignored and forgotten. The flapper pie was more popular in Canada, but it definitely found its footing in the US during the Great Depression. During this time, most of the ingredients for the flapper pie became pretty easy to acquire. If you want to imagine the taste, visualize a custard pie with a vanilla core that's topped with whipped cream or a complimentary meringue. You can also encase it in cracker crust. In the custard filling, it was common to use whiskey by some people who wanted to elevate the flavor of the pie during rough times. But mostly, everyone settled with vanilla or lemon peels that added enough flavor anyway. Though by the 60s, the pie was largely forgotten because of changing economical situations and the emergence of newer desserts. This pie was more so a hack for people to use up unripe tomatoes that grew in their gardens, back when gardening was less of a hobby and more of a job for many Americans. The forgotten green tomato pie was made with cinnamon, spices of the creator's choice, flour, raisins, and sliced green tomatoes. It was all cooked upon a stovetop before the pie was transferred into a pastry dish to be baked. Sometimes cloves would also be added, and this pie would turn into a savory lunch. Many upper-class people would add mincemeat as they could afford to include a protein into the dish. This is a pie you definitely won't hear about much anymore because it faded into obscurity, and there hasn't been any reason to revive it since. The transparent pie was a Kentucky specialty that wasn't widely known outside the region. Before its decline, it was particularly a holiday favorite. The pie would often get confused with chess pies from the South or pecan pies, but they really just look alike more than anything else. You might find the name misleading, as the pie is not actually totally transparent, but more of a beige-ish off-white color. It rose to fame because exotic ingredients were harder to get in Kentucky during the 1800s, so home bakers in small towns turned towards easily obtainable ingredients to create the transparent pie. Conventionally, it would be made with ingredients like sugar, flour, eggs, butter, whipping cream, vanilla extract, brown and white sugar, a jelly filling, and just a bit of bourbon to make for a state classic. Historically, the Huckleberry Pie used to be a huge part of Native American culture and cuisine. Before American settlers appropriated it, it was a dish they would make annually with simple enough ingredients like huckleberries, flour, cornstarch, a few sticks of butter for the filling and the crust to get a golden, crispy texture, sugar, and some citrus juice. You'd first prepare the crust, and for this specific pie, it's best to go with a traditional crust, then the filling, before assembling and baking it. The popularity of Huckleberry Pie died down in households as modernization happened in a post-colonial era, leaving this pie to fade into history with only some states ever looking to revive it. The cottage cheese pie found its footing in America due to its unique texture and flavor, which resembles a fragrance similar to fresh nutmeg. Its versatility as either breakfast, dessert, or even a Saturday brunch option paired with its relatively straightforward recipe made it a hit. Though it did have its most famous days in the 1930s-60s. The decline in its popularity was mostly because of changing tastes and fast food culture. There's just less of a focus on the morning breakfast or brunch at some comfy cafe type of lifestyle now. This delicious piece of history was made using 15 ounces of cottage cheese, flour, sugar, 1 grated lemon, milk or cream, and a pie crust, which you can make from scratch or use store-bought ones. Oatmeal pie was pretty famous in the 1900s when it was often compared to a pecan pie, but with a filling made from oatmeal. This pie was popular during times of rationing and frugality, but became less common as more luxurious desserts became accessible. Now, there have been a lot of different and contradicting accounts as to when this pie actually first popped up. Some go back to the Civil War in the South Carolina region, which would place the pie's creation around the 1800s. The traditional makeup of the dish has not changed a lot, though. You'd need a 9-inch pie crust, 4 eggs, sugar, flour, grounded cinnamon, a dash of salt, some light cornstarch or syrup, a generous teaspoon of vanilla, some melted butter, and quick-cooking oatmeal. It was a pretty simple, healthy, and great way to spice up oatmeal back in its day. This decadent black bottom pie was first found in 1870, created by a Swiss chef by the name of Felix Weidmann. The pie featured a rich chocolate layer topped with a creamy rum or vanilla custard. It was a hit in the mid-20th century, but eventually lost its allure to more modern chocolate desserts. The dessert first came to America in the early 60s with a famous professor of maths, Fred Bamforth, who always brought black bottom pie to gatherings. He would gatekeeper his secret recipe out of love for his wife. Still, he struck gold with a simple recipe. The pie was a great mix of milk, eggs, meringue, custard, vanilla, and some good quality rum. You can imagine, it was always a hit at the dinners. But as time would have it, this dessert also went out of fashion. Do these classic yet forgotten pies tempt you to revive them just so you can have a taste? If so, like this video, click subscribe, and stay tuned for more nostalgia trips.